Alright, so what we have here is we've got our image showing up here in the middle. We've got our layers, and the one that I'm working with on the sides here, and I'm making sure I select the actual layer that I want to work with. If I select the wrong layer, then it'll tell me that I can't mess with it because it says the layer is locked, or it might say that the layer is empty. So for instance, if I make a new layer, I have a new layer here, it's actually empty. You can see that there's nothing in this little circle, or this little square, and I can actually move that up above something. Well, you say, well, what does that do? Well, let me show you something else. All of these tools are unique. They all do something different. There's lots of things that's possible. This one here, and you might see one that looks like a paint bucket. It also is a gradient tool. So what I want to show you is this. When I have a layer like this, I can actually fill that layer with color or with pixel value, color values. If you go down here, there's these two boxes. These two boxes represent what's called a foreground and a background, and I can swap these back and forth. This is the foreground now, and this is the background. If I double click on one of those, I can use my color picker here. This is the classic color picker. It allows me to choose colors based on the actual color hue here up in the upper right hand corner, and then it desaturates a color by going across, and it changes the brightness of the color by going down, and it changes the value by adding gray to it by moving down in this direction. So every color has a series of hue, saturation, brightness values. Okay? Now, depending on what you're trying to do, you can change this. So as I slide this up, say I want a hue value in the value of this dark blue. Well, I've got a hue value here with saturation of 100% blue, with 100% saturation, which means it's here. But as I move it around, you can see these numbers change. And all those numbers represent the different quantities of information, or color, or light, or if it was ink, more ink in this realm, take an ink away. You can think of it like that. And so I get all these numbers. I also have what's called a hexadecimal value number that represents that color as well. So if I chose the hue 110 with a saturation, well, the hue 110 would be this. At the very top, it's this green with 100% saturation and 100% brightness, and R value of 42, and a fully saturated value of green. 255 is the most you can have. 0 is not having any. So this has 42 out of 255, actually 256, because it's 0 through 255. And so it's basically just the different combinations of colors that you can choose from. So I can choose a color. Let's say I want to choose a color here, but you'll notice that if I go off of this, it'll actually choose a color from this background. So I could choose, say, this color right here, and that comes up being a hue of 57. So it's kind of a greenish yellow color. If I chose something a little bit more green, like say this down here, it moves this over a little bit. But if I chose this orange color over here, you'll notice that the hue slider goes down to the orange, and then it gives me some of this color here. This more of a desaturated with a little bit of a gray added to it. If I said OK, that would give me my foreground color, and I can click on the background color, and I could choose maybe a darker color down here, and I would say OK, and that gives me a dark brown. Well, I have a foreground value and a dark ground value, and what I can do is I can use my gradient tool to create a change of color from one point to another. So if I go into my empty layer here, this layer that is just waiting for color, and if I have my gradient tool selected and I click from the bottom and drag to the top, and I get this line and I release, it fills that layer with color, starting from where I started from and where I end from. So wherever I started my drag, if I start my drag this way, it will fill starting from the foreground to the background. If I started it at the top, if I want to go from the bottom to the top, the foreground is at the bottom, the dark is at the top. If I want the light at the top and the dark at the bottom, if I want to do a little swatch, I get more of a band. If I do a tiny little spot, I get more of a hard edge. Okay? There are different types. I can do a radial fill. I can do a diamond kind of fill. I can do a double split gradient kind of thing. It gives me up and down, radiates out, and there's just different kinds like this. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with that. Okay? So what's neat is I can pull that down and stack it by moving and clicking and dragging it underneath. So it's underneath my koala bear. And the easiest way to see that is if I go back up to my simple selection tool and I say I drag some of these pixels, or if I just drag the series of pixels and hit delete, you can see that the hole, I left a hole, and whatever's under there is visible. Now my koala bear, original koala bear picture is underneath that. Okay? Hit Control Alt Z, and that allows me then to create a new layer. Okay? So that gives me a lot of things that I can work with. So let's look at some of these other tools. These are all basic types of selection tools. This is a cropping tool that we're not going to talk about because it basically allows you to crop in an image into a smaller, basically a smaller image. If I wanted to crop something in, make my image smaller. I do not, and so I am not going to do that. This is my eyedropper, which allows me to choose colors from within my picture. So if I wanted this specific gray color, I can get that. If I wanted this specific brown color, I can choose that. And it samples that value and gives me those values up here. So if I wanted to use that, say, to paint, I'm going to make another layer. So here's my layer number 2, and I'm going to say funny face. All right, so I have my funny face layer, and I can go up to this paintbrush. And one of the other things that Photoshop allows you to do is it allows you to manipulate images, and you can do what's called painting, digital painting. It's also a digital painting tool. And so by default, if I go up, notice that my menus change. Every time I choose one of these, the menus change. Well, the paintbrush has different menus to choose from. And if I click up here to this box here, this gives me the ability to change what's called different profile brushes. So I have different brushes, different brush types that I can choose from. Now I'm not going to get into all of the details of brushes at this particular second, but once I choose a brush, I can then go onto my picture and I can click and drag and I can paint. If I want to use my right square bracket, I can enlarge my paintbrush. I'm going to hit Control Alt Delete. If I use my left square bracket, I can make my paintbrush smaller. Okay. Same goes for the eraser. I can choose my eraser and I can choose a profile brush. And as I erase, I can remove the pixels. Now, I'm only erasing pixels in my funny face layer. If I went to my base layer, I could, if I erased those, I'm erasing that and it's revealing the layer below it. So I can actually erase pixels if I wanted to. Say I wanted to do that. And it's revealing whatever is below it. Because remember, you're like painting on glass. I'm going to hit Control Z and undo all my, I'm hitting Control Alt Z and I'm undoing those. Now what's also neat about brushes, I'm going to go back up to my brushes, make sure I'm working on my layer, is that I can get different types of brushes. Brushes that might look more like, I'm going to double click that, look more like a paint splotch or something like that. So I could actually put paint splotches and smear things like so. Okay, well that's actually kind of handy. I'm going to undo that just so I can go back a little bit. As an eraser tool, because I could erase. I go down to my paint splotch again. Double click it to close that. Open this up, and if I did want to, I could. Oops, wrong one. I can remove then different parts in a pattern like a brush. Now there's a lot more to the brush than just that. You can actually manipulate the brush in a lot. And that in itself is a topic that could go on for an hour or two. But I will show you some basics for that. Alright? So that's your brush. And if you want to change your brush, you can expand this window down. You can manipulate the brush like so. I can change the shape of the brush if I want. Sorry, go back up to my, oops, I deleted my layer, so I'm going to, if I go here, if I go expand this down, if I change this, change it, I can make the brush bigger. So you can see that the brush now is more narrow. So it's essentially like having a paintbrush that you would be dabbing, and when you dabbed it in paint and just blotched it, that would be what's called the profile of that brush. Now you can open up other windows that are helpful to you. One of them, if you're going to work with brushes, is the brush window, and that will open up a panel like this, where I can manipulate the size of my brush. And what's helpful is the spacing, where you can actually space out. So if I clicked and dragged now, because the spacing is a little bit different, I don't get such a smear like I did right here. Okay, I'm going to change the color of my brush so you can see it. I'm playing it a little too safe here. It's very hard to see. Okay, so now I have a brush that I can work with. And the cool thing about it is that you can actually add different sizes. So as I paint, it can change the size of my brush, and if I change the angle, it can change the angle of it. So it actually adds a lot of variation to your brush pattern. So you don't end up with just a smear. You can actually look like paint. It can actually look like a paint brush, like you're actually painting something. Okay? And so manipulating all of these things, I can have it scatter, so whenever I draw across, it scatters across. Those things are very, very helpful when you're looking to try to create more natural types of patterns instead of just looks like you're smearing something. These are the little icons for the brush information and the brush presets, which allow you to adjust these different stroke types. And there's lots of brush libraries that you can open up and look at. If you wanted to change the brush to something else, you can go to this icon for settings. You can choose different types of brushes. So if I wanted to say, if I wanted to use let's see, I like the faux finish brushes. If I click that, it'll say, do I want to replace it or append to it? If I say replace it, it will just replace the whole thing with new brush palette with new brushes. So here's a new set of brushes that looks like a feather. Or if I say I want to append, that means that I'll add these calligraphy brushes, and I will append it to the current brushes. And you notice that now I have a series of brushes here that added onto it. Instead of getting a whole bunch of new ones, it just added more to this. So if I wanted to add some more, let's say I added my drop shadow brushes, I'll just append there, and I get more added to my palette. Alright, so that kind of gets things going here.